Well, Netta, thank you so much. It's truly a pleasure to be here and to see the friends, very few of whom I know. I have no idea where all of you are located, but with Zoom, it could be anywhere these days. But it's wonderful to see all of you. I'm a newbie at this. This is the first time I've joined Baha'i Chronicles, so I have no idea what your usual format is, if it differs with each keynoter or how it goes exactly. But we have 4 chapters to cover tonight, which means about, what, 20, 21, 22, 23 minutes per talk. If some timekeeper could please remind me when we reach the end of the 20 minutes so we can move on to the next talk. Maybe Netta could do that. Netta, are you going to be here
Absolutely.
throughout?
Absolutely.
Okay, excellent. Is there a central point where most of you friends are located, or are you all over the United States and Canada?
Well, I know
Netta?
they're all over the United States, some Canada. We have a guest from Africa, Evely, who always joins us, who's very consistent. So yeah, you have a good range.
Okay, now I'm not sure how it worked in your other classes. I don't know, but let's take a look. I'm not doing a PowerPoint, so I'm very low tech. I warned Netta about that I'm very low tech. So I'm hoping, friends, that you have the Some Answered Questions, the latest edition, in front of you, and we'll turn to chapter 16. Intelligible realities and their expression through sensible forms. So Abdu'l-Baha, just to start this discussion off, he's distinguishing between 2 types of knowledge, and he says that this point that he's making is pivotal for what is going to follow subsequently. So that we have knowledge that is acquired through the senses. This is self-evident. But then he speaks of the knowledge of intelligible things. That is, it consists of intelligible realities which have no outward form or place and which are not sensible. For example, the power of the mind is not sensible, nor are any of the human attributes. These are intelligible realities. Love likewise is an intelligible and not a sensible reality. For the ear does not hear these realities, the eye does not see them, the smell does not sense them, the taste does not detect them, the touch does not perceive them. Even the ether, the forces of which are said in natural philosophy to be heat, light, electricity, and magnetism, is an intelligible and not a sensible reality. Likewise, nature itself is an intelligible and not a sensible reality. The human spirit is an intelligible and not a sensible reality. Okay, by the way, I'll tell you as an aside that when I was a student in Paris in the late 60s, I had the very great privilege of that Laura Dreyfus Barney accepted that I visit her. She was 88 years old at the time and propped up in bed. I was 21, and I consider myself a very lucky individual that I had that interview with her that I wrote up on my website. All right, I have a question for you, my dear friends. Abdu'l-Baha says these intelligible realities are things in the mind, so to speak. But is it not true? This is a question I have when I was preparing for this evening. Isn't it true, nonetheless, that these intelligible realities are vehicled through the senses? For example, love is expressed through the senses in a variety of ways. So here is the teacher who doesn't have the answer. So this was the question that came to my mind here. When I read this over, Abdu'l-Baha makes this distinction then between information, knowledge that is vehicled through the senses. This is self-evident. We would be in a position of total ignorance if we'd be like a stone if we didn't have the use of the five senses. But isn't it also true, friends, that these, this is my question, these what Abdu'l-Baha calls intelligible realities, I'm not sure what the original Persian is here in the Mufawazat, but it's being translated as intelligible realities. Is it not true that these things are nonetheless vehicled through the senses? Anybody?
Yeah, Jack, let me try a shot at that.
Okay.
What he's saying here is fundamental to all language, and that is we have those things which have sensory perceptions, but those things which do not have sensory perceptions, but love, I think, does have a sensory perceptions, and I'll disagree with you modestly on that. But all other things which are intellectual in nature are dependent upon the sensory vocabulary, these abstractions, and this is true of all languages. There's a difference between that which is tangible, that was intangible, the noumena and the phenomenon. In all languages, this is fundamental. And as far as I know, human beings are the only species that clothe themselves and that have a language other than the sensory, and that is the abstract language with which to communicate more intricate kinds of things.
Thank you, John. Yes, I do understand that distinction very well. But nonetheless, Abdu'l-Baha has separated these two, put them into two different categories. And what I'm, for illustrative purposes, but I'm wondering if they don't mesh to some extent.
Let me continue. For the intellectual ones, we need the vocabulary of the sensory ones.
Yes.
But the vocabulary is not concrete and specific. We use it in a number of different ways. For instance, I might say I'm going to knock on the door, which can mean a whole lot of things. It means I'm going to enter your house, or it means I have a new idea to share with you. And so we use the language of the sensory to express the abstract things.
That's of course true. Okay, thank you, John. Let's move on to paragraph 4 then. And Abdu'l-Baha, John has just paraphrased what Abdu'l-Baha is saying here, but when you undertake to express these intelligible realities, you have no recourse but to cast them in the mold of the sensible, for outwardly there is nothing beyond the sensible. So we're perforce obliged to use sensible imagery to explain these intelligible things. For example, grief and happiness are intelligible things, but when you wish to express these spiritual conditions, you say, my heart became heavy, or my heart was uplifted, although one's heart is not literally made heavy or lifted up. Rather, it is a spiritual or intelligible condition, the expression of which requires the use of sensible terms. Okay, well, maybe that's been clarified then in my
Could I make a comment?
Oh, please, anybody.
One of the things I thought about of the intelligible realities is they are more like portals to the heart, not the physical heart, but the spiritual heart. And those intelligible realities are part of the immensity of this fathomless, unknowable ocean of the revelation of Baha'u'llah. So even though we do use the things we understand to try to give them substance on their own, they are literally potentially a portal to the heart. And that's just my feeling about it, because they are the types of things that take us home. Thy heart is my home. And that was just kind of my feeling about it.
I think that's right. And I'd just like to take a moment to greet my cousin Penny Hubbard. Penny, I just noticed that you're there. So hello. Anyway, Netta, thank you very much for focusing in on the speaker when someone makes a comment, because I have to move around to see who's actually speaking. So I cannot, unless you assist me there, I can't actually see who's speaking. I have to look around and find the individual. So this also is, as I think John was indicating in his comment, has a lot to do with figurative language and the way that we express ourselves poetically. I think one of the points that Abdul Baha is making here is that we have to have recourse to, if you like, literary devices and figures of speech in order to express these spiritual realities, which are the intelligible things. Okay, and so in paragraph 5, of course, he uses the example of knowledge being either light or darkness, and tells us, of course, that these are not literally true, but these are symbols. These are analogies, comparisons, metaphors. They can be similes. And he gives the example, the Christian example of the physical dove. At the time when Christ began his mission, the Old Testament, God appearing in a pillar of fire and so on and so forth. So this is basic to the understanding of religious symbolism. And as you know, friends, in the Quran, Baha'u'llah takes great pains to explain some of this religious symbolism. Now, that have hindered religionists in the various religions from acknowledging the prophetic figure when he appears in the world. And this fits in with the topic of chapter 16. I think Baha'is have a relatively advanced understanding of these things and take it rather for granted. I think we take it for granted. Those of us that have had the privilege of a higher education. But, you know, I think Baha'u'llah is making the point, and the point is still true, that this symbolic understanding of Scripture is not as widespread as we would like it to be. There is still a great deal of literalism, the literal mindset when it comes to interpreting Scripture. So, for example, you recall that the Bob's uncle could not understand how his nephew could be the Qaim. And that, of course, gave rise to the Kitab-i-Iqan itself. Okay, anybody else would like to make a comment at this point?
I think Mehdi has his hand raised, so let's go to Mehdi, please.
Yes, it's important, I think, to consider that this chapter is the very first one in the section of some answered questions called Some Christian Subjects. So these whole series of chapters is in that context. And when we're talking about literalism in Scripture, it's pretty much a doctrine of the faith in most conservative Christian circles that the Bible must be interpreted literally, otherwise then you're not being faithful to the text. And if you go otherwise, then you're just engaging in your own flights of fancy.
Yes, of course, this is, thank you, Mehdi. Of course, this is, I mean, literalists are going to be caught in their own trap because, you know, Abdu'l-Baha also, I'm not sure where I read this, maybe it's in one of the next chapters. Jesus also spoke about the baptism of fire, along with the baptism of water, right? So obviously, no matter how literalist the conservative churches are, the evangelicals, they don't do a baptism of fire, do they? So, you know, you can see how literalism really breaks down at some point. Anybody else there? I can't see, of course.
Yeah,
Ron.
we do have Nancy. So I'm going to ask Nancy to unmute herself, please.
Yeah, this always brings to mind to me because I studied developmental psychology, and we're talking about humanity is going through stages of development into maturity. One of the stages, I think it was Piaget that talked about the ability to think in terms of to come out of the state of literalism and move into mature ability to think about things symbolically. So, you know, to me, Baha'u'llah and Abdu'l-Baha are saying, you know, these are symbols and illusions and metaphors because we're coming into the stage of humanity's maturity. And more people will be able to think in that way. But for some who are still in the previous stage of development, thinking-wise, cognitively, it's a real challenge.
Yes, yes, it is. And you know, Nancy, thank you for that comment. And this problem has not gone away for us as Baha'is either. I mean, I still, perhaps you do, come across passages in the sacred writings, and it's not absolutely clear in every case which is symbolic and which is literal.
Mm-hmm.
So while the problem has to some extent, to a great extent, been solved for Baha'is, and as Nancy has just pointed out, the abstract reasoning, and thank you for making that reference to Piaget and the stages of development and so on. The problem can still persist in certain passages in our sacred writings.
Well, in some cases, I think that it might be that you can see it in two ways, you know, that two ways are equally valid. There's the literal, and then there's also the figurative, because each passage has many meanings, perhaps.
Yes, and you know, Baha'u'llah talks about the batin and the what's the other term he uses in Persian or Arabic? Oh, I've forgotten. The inner and the outer, the exoteric and the esoteric, the literal and the figurative. And Shoghi Effendi says they have to be juxtaposed one to the other. There are exceptions to this rule, of course, with ritual and law in the faith. When Baha'u'llah says, wash your hands before the prayer, he means wash your hands. He doesn't mean purify your heart. Well, I mean, washing your hands could be, I suppose, a symbol of, but those passages are not to be interpreted figuratively. If we're given ritual instructions regarding prayer and fasting, they're meant to be understood literally. And he says, don't tawil them, don't tawil them, don't give them an esoteric interpretation. Same thing when he says that a manifestation of God will not appear before 1,000 years. He says, don't tawil it, or tawil in the Arabic pronunciation. Don't give it a figurative interpretation. I mean 1,000 years. But generally, I think your point is very valid, Nancy, where we can superimpose or juxtapose the zahir, the outer, and the batin, the inner esoteric meaning. You know, that's a satisfactory solution. And of course, the nature of the symbol itself, friends, is that it causes us to reflect about things at a deeper level of consciousness. So these things are not just pretty literary devices that are meant to embellish the text. In a way, they're like verbal architecture or mandalas that cause us to think more deeply in much deeper dimensions, and we can use them for meditative purposes. We can use these symbols as objects of meditation. Okay, how are we doing for time on?
Well, we just have a few more minutes, but before we give it back to you, I have one more question here from Bijan. Bijan, please unmute yourself, and then we just have a few more minutes for this chapter. Please, Bijan.
Thank you, Neda.
Thank you, Neda. I know because of the time, Neda is very concerned, and I'll make it very short. You mentioned about the word regarding intelligible realities. The Persian word for it is ma'uliyat or haqayiq ma'uliyah, means things that have to do with your aql. Aql is brain and reasoning. And that's how Abdul Baha here, it gives us simple examples and differentiate between the things that has to do with the intelligible realities and sensible realities. And it seems like that here, Abdul Baha again here is putting everything in perspective, because in the few chapters that we are going to study tonight, or even after that, he uses these reasonings and these intelligible realities, and that's the base of our reasoning to understand the old prescript. Thank you very much.
Yes, yeah, thank you, Bijan. It's quite accurate. It's Mehdi made the same point earlier, that this is all, what follows is contingent upon having this understanding. And of course, perhaps the last thing we can look at there is in paragraphs 8, 9, and 10, when he himself, Abdul Baha, refers to this verse of, in the tablet to Nasruddin Shah, O king, I was but a man like others, asleep upon my couch, when lo, the breezes of the all-glorious were wafted over me and taught me the knowledge of all that hath been. This thing is not from me, but from one who is almighty, the all-knowing. And the station of divine revelation, he tells us, is not a sensible, but an intelligible reality. It is sanctified from and transcendent above past, present, and future. So, you know, he's basically saying there, we shouldn't misunderstand that Baha'u'llah, the Blessed Beauty, was sleeping and then he awoke as a manifestation of God. It's not a literal happening. These are figures of speech that we use to explain, if you like, the transference from his pre-mission to when his mission actually began. Okay. So we'll go on to chapter 17, unless anybody else has a final comment on chapter 16 there. Now, of course, anything that I say is merely opinion. I make mistakes every day of some kind or another, so I'm not holding dogmatically here to anything that I say, and I do make mistakes, so let that be clear. Okay, now in chapter 17, in the old translation of Some Answered Questions, there's a footnote there that says this type of discussion that Abdu'l-Baha relates between the natural philosopher and the theologian, if you like. He calls them the divine and the material philosophers, or the scientist and the religionist, if you like, to put it in different words. How that sometimes these discussions cannot be easily resolved. And if they can't be easily resolved, then they must be left, because there are simply some things that people are not going to agree about. So he's So he's presenting here the point of view of the material philosopher, if you like, the scientifically minded person, who says that, well, according to the laws of nature, it's impossible that Christ could have been born without the instrumentality of a human father. And in chapter, he begins in chapter 3 with the Quranic verse, which of course is perfectly harmonized with the gospel account of the virgin birth, which is not to be confused, by the way, with the Immaculate Conception, which is a Catholic doctrine that Mary was born without sin, because for the Catholic Church it would be inconceivable that the mother of Christ could have given birth to such a being if she had been tainted with original sin, which is, of course, a dogma in the Roman Catholic Church. So Pius IX, the same Pope who proclaimed, that Baha'u'llah wrote to, and who proclaimed papal infallibility, was the author of this doctrine of the Immaculate Conception of Mary, which means that Mary was born without sin, which is a different thing from the virgin birth, which is what Abdu'l-Baha is talking about here. Sometimes in ordinary language, people confuse the two, but they're quite different. So the answer of the divine philosopher, if you like, or the theologian, is that, let's go to, and the materialist would even, to prove his point, he could even have recourse to the Quran, couldn't he, or she, that God created everything in pairs. So the materialist could argue, well, look, your own holy book says this. So this can't be true that Christ was born without pairing, as it's called here. So the answer of the divine philosopher as a theologian is in paragraph 5, such a thing is not impossible, although it has not been observed. And there is a difference between that which is impossible and that which has merely not been observed. For example, in the days before the telegraph, the instantaneous communication of East and West had not been observed, but was not impossible. Likewise, the photograph and the phonograph had not been observed, but were not impossible. Now you'll see what's happening here, why in the previous edition of some answered questions, there was the footnote. So then Abdu'l-Baha is referring to a kind of contentious discussion here. So then the material philosopher answers that they insist upon their belief. The divine philosophers reply now in paragraph 6, is this terrestrial globe eternal or was it originated? So the theologian comes back with a question. The material philosophers answer that according to well-established scientific findings, it is proven to be originated, that in the beginning it was a molten sphere and gradually became temperate, that a crust was formed around it, and that upon this crust plants came into being, then animals, and finally man. And then the divine philosopher goes on to make the point. It follows clearly from your statement that the human species upon the terrestrial globe was originated and is not eternal. And then he deduces something from that, or she deduces something from that. Then surely the first man had neither father nor mother, following from the argument, the materialistic argument of how the earth was originated, that it was a molten sphere, became temperate, a crust was formed around the earth, and then the various kingdoms came into being. And so the divine philosopher responds in this debate. Then surely the first man had neither father nor mother, for the existence of the human species has an origin in time. And he goes on to build on the argument there. Now, which is more problematic, that man should come into being, albeit gradually, with neither father nor mother, or that he should come into being without a father? Okay, so the theologian or the divine philosopher here is presenting a kind of intellectual argument to the scientist, and he's attempting to catch him at his own words, and he's saying, then surely you must admit by your own explanation that the first human being had neither father nor mother. So what's your problem? So what is your problem with accepting the fact that Jesus was born without the instrumentality of a human father? So you see how the dialectic, the conversation is going back and forth. As you admit that the first man came into being with neither father nor mother, whether it be gradually or in a short period of time, there can remain no doubt that a man without a human father is also possible and logically admissible. One cannot therefore simply reject this as impossible, and to do so would betray a lack of fairness. For example, if you say that this lamp was once lit with neither wick nor oil, and then say that it is impossible for it to be lit without the wick, this betrays a lack of fairness. Christ had a mother, but the first man, according to the material philosophers, had neither father nor mother. So in your mind, friends, is Abdu'l-Baha suggesting here, well, let me make a statement and then ask a question. I think he's anticipating that these kinds of discussions are going to take place in religion and philosophy, that there's going to be attempts to intellectually convince one another through means of analogy and reasoning and inductive reasoning and deductive reasoning and all of that. But is he saying at the end, how do you read it, that they have reached a satisfactory conclusion, or is it still an open question? How are you reading paragraph 7? Anybody?
Yeah, I think we have Dwayne. Dwayne, please unmute yourself.
Oh, I want to go back to paragraph 6 and point out how amazing, how accurate this is, given Abdu'l-Baha's lack of education, that he knew that once the globe was a molten sphere and it gradually became temperate. He's living in the East, and where did he get this from? I think it's pretty amazing. Huh. Huh.
Yeah, thank you, Dwayne. And I do see that you actually even shared something with us from that same section. So thank you. Yeah, I think Jack is gonna join us. Just give.
Somehow I got out of the Zoom. Can you still hear me?
We can hear you, but we can't see you, but that's okay.
So I'll go back to join a meeting, and hopefully it'll bring me back to you here.
Okay.
I think I'm back.
Okay. There you go. Perfect.
Oh. Okay, good.
So did you hear what Dwayne was saying about how accurate Abdu'l-Baha wrote or expressed himself in paragraph 6? Did you hear him when he said that?
No, could you repeat the point, please, then?
Okay, Dwayne, please.
That he said that in the beginning, the Earth was a molten sphere. It gradually became temperate. The crust was formed around that. On this crust, plants came to being, and animals, and finally man. And given his lack of education, it's really amazing that he knew this kind of stuff.
Well, yes, he did. One of the things I think, is it my turn again, Netta?
Yes, it is.
Okay. I think one of the things that Abdu'l-Baha is suggesting here, friends, by inference, is that we should be, this is a religion science debate that's going on here. It's not exactly a consultation, it's a dialectic. And I think what Abdu'l-Baha is suggesting here is that religionists should be familiar with science to the extent that's possible, because the divine philosopher in this particular example here in paragraph 6 that Dwayne has just pointed out, he's making a broadly based, scientific argument. He's talking about the formation of the earth, a molten sphere that gradually became temperate, then a crust was formed, and upon that crust, plants came into being, then animals, and finally man. So, this is roughly a scientific statement that he's making here. And so by inference, I think Abdu'l-Baha is suggesting that in these types of conversations, particularly at the more advanced levels, with the kind of material that we have in some answered questions, we need to have a lot of deepening on a lot of subjects. He says, I think it's in The Secret of Divine Civilization, that if a Muslim is going to debate a Christian, he has to know the gospel. This is self-evident. Okay, anybody else?
Yes, Derek Polk. Derek, if you could please unmute yourself.
Yes, Guy Murchie in the Seven Mysteries of Life, he
Yeah,
talks
great
about
book.
it, and what he says is, so the principal biological evidence that the Virgin Mary had to have experienced a miracle, if not an immaculate misconception, to have given birth to Jesus is his maleness. Because what
Eric,
he,
could you come closer to your mic? I'm having a bit of difficulty hearing you.
okay,
Thank you.
Guy Murchie in the Seven Mysteries of Life, he's talking about, he says, now I lost where it was. So the principal biological evidence that the Virgin Mary had to have experienced a miracle, if not an immaculate misconception, to have given birth to Jesus is his maleness. You know, because he talks about how virgin birth is conceivably possible, but what made it a miracle was the fact that he was born male and not female.
And how does that change the argument?
Well, from a scientific, I guess where I'm reading it, again, this is how I'm reading it. He's saying from a scientific standpoint, you know, the materialist who says it's not possible, he's saying it is possible for there to be a virgin birth or a birth without a father. But in this particular case, if you want to say it's a miracle, it's because he was born male. Because again, the Y chromosome had to, you know, because the Y because the I guess how did, in other words, where did the Y chromosome come from?
Okay. Anybody else?
Alicia, did you want to comment? No, okay.
Well, of course, this brings us into the whole subject of miracles. Last night I was watching Professor Dawkins, the God delusion man, debating the Oxford mathematician from Northern Ireland, John. What's his name? Oh my goodness! There, I'm having one of those senior moments. His name has gone out of my head, but anyway, he worsted Professor Dawkins, beat him rather badly in my in my view, in that debate. And the subject of miracles, John. Anyway, if anybody knows who I'm talking about, please help me out here, but I've forgotten the name. He's a professor of mathematics and a Christian at Oxford from Northern Ireland. And he's maybe Lennox, is it? I don't know. John Lennox, possibly. Fantastic debater and a great apologist for Christianity. And this subject came up, and he essentially put it to Professor Dawkins, the same argument that Shoghi Effendi did, that is, the originator of the laws of nature and being all-powerful, God is perfectly able to suspend these laws at will. Yeah, there it is, John Lennox. Okay, thank you. Basically, that's how Professor Lennox put it to Dawkins, and I think he won the debate quite clearly, as far as I'm concerned. So here, you know, this brings up the subject, of course, of miracles. So that's basically what the Guardian has said about these sorts of things. And of course, he's going to go on to say in the next chapter that to put things into a larger perspective, that the greatness of Christ was not due to the fact that he was born without the instrumentality of a human father, but because of his spiritual perfections. But of course, in Christianity, the greatness of Christ is very much connected with the fact that he was born without the instrumentality of a human father. Okay. Any other? I haven't got much more to add. But I think it's a very interesting paradigm between, and it's not at all a fictional paradigm. You see these kinds of debates, especially, you know, with the religion science interface that's going on quite a bit now between quantum physics and spirituality. And those who are looking for quantum patterns in religion and spirituality are sometimes ridiculed by scientific materialists who call this woo, W-O-O. That may be based on the Dancing Woolly Masters, that book that was written by, was it Gary Dukoff? Gary, going to need help here again. But anyway, personally, I find these connections fascinating. How they're connecting quantum concepts like, for example, entanglement with spiritual concepts such as unity. Yet on the scientific side of things, there's a tendency to dismiss this sort of application as being not valid, as being less than serious. So, you know, the illustration of the kind of debate that Abdu'l-Baha is using here is very apropos. All right, who would like to make a comment or ask a question? Anybody on any of the subjects that we've touched on so far? Either to do with the virgin birth, which is not the Immaculate Conception, and the question of the aqla, the reason, the intelligible realities, the intellect, and their expression through sensible forms. Anybody there? Okay. Now, how are we doing time-wise for talk 2? Have we reached the 20 minutes?
Yeah, no, I think chapter 18 is very exciting, which is actually going to answer a lot. So let's proceed, please.
Okay, excellent. So the question in chapter 18 is, what is the virtue and benefit of being without a father? Now, friends, Laura Dreyfus Barney was somebody. Let me tell you, she was awarded the Légion d'honneur at 2 different levels for her contributions to the relief of suffering during World War I. But outside of that, I don't know exactly what her education was, but she was evidently a very brilliant person. I mean, she didn't go to theological college, but you can deduce from the kinds of questions that she asked the master that she had a very sophisticated knowledge of theology and philosophy. That's very clear from the kinds of questions that Laura Dreyfus Barney asked Abdu'l-Baha. So she follows up then in chapter 18 on these Christian questions with another good one. Okay, let's suppose we admit, and of course we do as Baha'is, in the veracity of the virgin birth. Then she follows up with the next question: what is the virtue and benefit of being without a father? So it's a good question. And of course, you've read the answer: a great man is a great man, whether or not he is born of a human father. So Abdu'l-Baha is trying to put this into to some perspective, to get us out of this miraculous mindset. Oh, Jesus is special because he was born without the instrumentality of a human father. And that is no doubt in my mind true in some way, and still remains to me something of a mystery. But Abdu'l-Baha, using logic here, if being without a father were a virtue, Adam would excel and surpass all the prophets and messengers, for he had neither father nor mother. So I don't think he's trying to minimize it, but he's trying to put it into a larger perspective. Because the question still remains, why was Jesus born that way? And I'm not sure I have an answer to that question. That which is conducive to greatness and glory are the splendors and outpourings of the divine perfections. The Son, S-U-N, is born of matter and form, which can be likened to father and mother, and still it is absolute perfection. Darkness has neither matter nor form, neither father nor mother, and yet it is sheer imperfection. The matter of Adam's physical life was dust, but the physical matter of Abraham was a pure seed. And it is certain that a pure and goodly seed is superior to earth and stone. So this is an interesting example that Abdu'l-Baha gives about Adam. And so I guess by analogy, if you're going to argue, oh, Christ was great because he was born of the Holy Spirit, well, God breathed into the dust of Adam the breath of life, and he became a living soul. So if you're going to start comparing miracles, which is the greater one? Christ was born, had a mother. In this particular argument, Adam had neither father nor mother. And so then he moves to the concept of the Son of God. In John 1, verses 12 to 13, it is said, "But as many as received him, to them gave he power to become the sons of God, even to them that believe on his name, which were born not of blood, nor of the will of the flesh, nor of the will of man, but of God." Follows clearly from this verse of John that even the existence of the apostles proceeds. Now, the apostles here, this does not refer to the Islamic designation of apostle, but I think he's talking here of the disciples of Christ. It follows clearly from this verse of John that even the existence of the apostles proceeds from a spiritual reality rather than from a material power, because the apostles also became the sons of God. Of course, I think in the King James Version, if anybody knows, maybe Mehdi knows or anybody else, is Son of God when it refers to Christ capitalized?
Actually, Mehdi does have his hand up. So Mehdi, could you please unmute yourself?
All right. Going backtrack a little bit, I think I have a possible answer as to the question about why it is that Jesus had a virgin birth. Jesus appeared to the Jewish people in Galilee, but we have to remember that the New Testament Gospels and pretty much everything of the New Testament was written in Koine Greek. And Koine Greek was the language of the empire of the time. That language was selected because the writers of the New Testament obviously wanted to spread the teachings as quickly as possible throughout the empire and beyond. So they used Greek. And I think the other factor to keep in mind, looking at this question, is that how to put it? The world of this time is transitioning from a mythological frame of reference to a philosophical one. So since the time of Thales and onwards, you have the Greek philosophers criticizing mythology. And this is continuing to develop in such wise that eventually the old pantheon of gods is starting to wane. But there are still this mythological context. And there's been arguments, in fact, that many of the gospel stories, or even in the book of Acts, is borrowing from the mythological context. There's shades of the stories of Heracles and so on in there. And I think this is the key to understanding the whole point about Jesus being conceived from the Holy Spirit. That's very much in the mythological frame of reference. So taking Baha'u'llah's principle that the messengers of God teach humankind according to the exigencies of the time, I think this particular form of conceiving and the way it's recorded in the New Testament is part of this. It's Jesus is conceived in this way, sort of in nod to this mythological context, which is still very strongly believed in at the time by a lot of people throughout the empire and beyond.
Well, thank you, Mehdi. That's a good point. But of course, except for the Jews, as Abdul Baha pointed out, they took that very point to, cast aspersions on his background, right? They saw it in a very, very different light.
Indeed, but that's just one of the other many disagreements and counters that Jesus is presenting to the Judaism of his time.
Okay, well, okay, Neda, yes?
Yeah, I also have Jamie. So Jamie, if you could please unmute yourself.
Yes, I'm a little confused because it's Abdu'l-Baha says the materialists, if the materialists believe this, then it's as if he's saying the materialists believe in Adam being the first man. And I'm thinking, well, that's the theologians who would believe that Adam was the first man. And if by materialists, he means scientists, that they wouldn't believe in the first man in that sense. So that's I'm a little confused there as why the analogy is made that materialists would have to accept that Adam had neither father nor
Yeah.
mother.
Right, Jamie, I see what you're saying, but I don't think Abdu'l-Baha is saying that the divine philosophers convince the materialists. He's saying that they're just making an argument. They're trying to convince them by using a scientific or a pseudoscientific approach. I don't think we can conclude from that that the materialists have accept the argument of the divine philosophers. They obviously would have a comeback.
Mm-hmm.
And I think this is one of the purposes of that particular dialogue, is that there is this back and forth, that when you get polarized positions like that, it either happened or it didn't happen. Just as we have great polarization today in the political world, particularly in the United States. We have it in Canada too, but not quite so dramatically. But whenever you get polarized positions, this is what's going to happen. And I think this particular talk, Jamie, of Abdu'l-Baha that you're referring to, I think is a kind of a model. He's kind of alerting us to where these kinds of discussions can go. And
That the argument is specious, so to speak. It's not.
And that there's not always a successful conclusion to them. That people, in spite of the fact that the theologian is trying to convince the materialist, he's not necessarily going to accept the spiritual point of view. I think maybe that's implicit in what he's saying. I don't know, there may be other ways to read this, but all we have is our own reasoning to go on to try to figure out the text. And I don't always figure it out correctly, but I think he's saying that this kind of back and forth goes on, and the theologian is trying to make a semi-scientific argument to convince him that, okay, go back to the formation of the earth, and when human beings first appeared on the earth, where did the first man come from? And you're objecting to the fact that Christ did not have a physical father because it's contrary to science. Well, what about when the human being first appeared on the face of the earth? He's making the argument that that first human being, if you like, had neither father nor mother. So
it just seems like that would be the argument to be made to the theologians, not to the scientists, because the scientists would say, well, there was already pairing before human beings evolved. You see, it's so.
Yeah, we'd have to ask Abdu'l-Baha why he said.
Yeah.
Well, we have to move along. We have 3 people. I'm going to go to Lena, and then and then of course, Lena, after you make your comment, I'm going to have Jack, of course, comment, and then we'll go to the next person because we are running a little bit behind here. So Lena, please unmute yourself.
Oh yeah.
Okay, I'll make this quick. Again, it's a personal perspective, like.
Yeah.
Oh, you have to unmute yourself, Lena. I don't know what happened. If you can just unmute yourself.
Okay, how's that?
Yes.
All right. Okay then. The point I want to make is from slightly different angle. I want to approach this issue. In my belief that the coming of every manifestation of God comes a test, at least one. Moses was a murderer. Christ's virgin birth. Baha'u'llah, 40 years of imprisonment. And we can go on. So this test, in my opinion, is for the people of the time. The people of the time. I mean, Moses is a murderer and he's telling them to believe in God. Something is not right here if you are living at that time. And then we have Christ. We have, who is he? He is the son of a carpenter from Nazareth, and he has a virgin birth. How much more trouble do you want? And you want us to believe in this. And then we can go on and on. But what I find interesting from my perspective is the test is for the people at the time. And then the test is for the people the following dispensation. We are, this conversation, the consultation is a perfect example of what I'm trying to talk. We are here 2,000 years later, still talking about the virgin birth. It does present problem for some people, not for others, but the point is, and then Muhammad, he was illiterate. He was illiterate, and he reveals this incredible word of God, this incredible book, but he couldn't read or write except numbers. So the point is, this is a sequential, progressive issue of a problem that is a test for believers. If any dispensation, it is a test for their belief. Okay, thank you. Done.
Yeah, Lena, right you are. And Baha'u'llah makes this very point in the Quran, doesn't he? That God's ways are not man's ways. And if you're going to choose a prophet, you don't choose a murderer. So the ways of God are very different from the ways of man. So Lena, what is the test of mankind for the coming of Baha'u'llah, do you think? Maybe 3 wives?
That is the wonderful mystery. That is the wonderful mystery. We don't know. And I'm very happy that I don't know. And I don't want to know.
Well, maybe
You're
it's
talking about the next dispensation?
no, for Baha'u'llah, for mankind to, what are they going to object to? It's Baha'u'llah.
Oh my goodness. I think there's a whole list for Baha'u'llah. There's a whole list of them.
That he was only 5 foot tall, like Midi's suggesting.
I think that should be the subject of another class. We should all think about it.
Okay. Or that he had 3 wives or whatever. Anyway.
Well, one of the biggest things is that he was coming from a country that was decrepit and falling apart and barbarian. And how can something good come? You know, the same was said for Christ. But how can something good from the Iran of that time? So that's to start out with. What does Iran have to tell the world? What has somebody from Iran has to tell the world?
Okay,
Yeah.
we have one more here. Afsaneh, please unmute yourself.
My comment was about in relation to Jamie's point. One of the Baha'i principles is harmony between science and religion. And then this question about Adam was the first man. Maybe Abdul Baha was saying that there is a point that scientists and materialists agree. So this was the first example of the harmony between science and religion. And then maybe that would be the starting point to harmonize them.
Oh, that's interesting, Afsaneh. Okay, you think that Abdul Baha is showing a harmonization of the views in that particular talk?
That's what I was thinking.
Whereas you may be right. Whereas in the older edition of Some Answered Questions, they say that's an editorial comment, by the way. It's not what Abdul Baha is saying. But they said this is an example of a type of a dialogue that's difficult to resolve. Personally, I don't see the resolution there myself because I don't think, and I'm not saying you're wrong, Afsaneh, either, but I'm not sure that the materialist, the scientifically minded person was convinced by the divine philosopher. But anyway, you know, every time I participate on a deepening on Zoom, it's always, I realize how much we don't know in this great cause and how much we all still have to learn. Every time I think I've got something figured out, in the next moment it can all evaporate. So we're all just striving to understand it. But you may well be right. I think Netta was nodding her head. Did you see it that way too?
Yeah, I absolutely do see it that way, and I'm so appreciative that Apsana brought that up. So very good. We only have just a few more minutes left for chapter 19. So if I can.
Oh my gosh, we're way behind. The baptism.
Yes.
So the session ends in how much time, Netta?
It ends in 15. So if we could maybe have you in 10, so then we can allow 5 minutes for some Q&A, that would be great.
Okay, so 10 minutes for chapter 19 and
5 for a Q&A, please.
Do my best. Just stop me if I'm rumbling on. Okay, now the baptism. Baptism, I wrote an academic paper. I was fascinated by the figure of John the Baptist years ago. And he is a very fascinating figure because Jesus, as you know, said he was a prophet and more than a prophet. And what did you go out to see, said Jesus, a reed shaking in the wind? Indicating that when John was baptizing in the Jordan, he was steadfast. He was immovable as a mountain. What did you go out to see? A reed shaking in the wind, said Jesus. But baptism was an ancient practice in Israel long before the Baptists came along. And it's interesting here that John, of course, recognized Jesus, and Jesus came to be baptized from John. Now, this is a historical, according to the gospel, we have two manifestations of God meeting. I'm not saying that John the Baptist had the same station as Christ, but we have two prophets of God who were physically related. They were cousins. In Catholic tradition, they played together as children. They knew one another. They each had a divine mission. The mission of John the Baptist was to prepare the way for the coming of Christ. And here we have Jesus going to be baptized by John. John looks at him. He knows that he's the Messiah. And he says, Lord, you do not need baptism from me. And Jesus answers him, suffer it now to be so the law may be fulfilled. This is basically the substance. Abdul Baha'i is summarizing here the gospel account. And he says in paragraph 4, as Christ desired that this custom instituted by John be practiced by all at that time. And there were great multitudes that did go out to be baptized by John, which angered, of course, the Jewish clergy because their sanctuary, their basis for worship was the temple in Jerusalem. And here we had masses of people going off to the Jordan to be baptized by John. They were not pleased by that. He himself submitted to it that souls might be awakened, that the law which had been issued from the former religion might be fulfilled. So baptism was a law of John, and Christ was showing that he wanted to conform to it, just as Baha'u'llah wanted to conform to the laws of the Bayan. For even though this custom was instituted by John, it represented in reality the purification of repentance, which has been practiced in all the divine religion. Okay, so the symbolic meaning of baptism is purification by repentance, and repentance means basically conversion. You have to have a change of heart. You have to have a change of mind. And of course, you know that in the church, there were endless debates over the centuries, aspersion, just scattering water on, full immersion in some of the evangelical churches, and so on and so forth. In the case of full immersion, by the way which Lua Getzinger tried before she became a Baha'i and was expecting something miraculous to happen, she discovered that she was the same after she had the baptism as she was before. I read that somewhere. Was the idea that when you came out of the water, this symbol had an impact on your spiritual being and you saw yourself in some other way, different way. You were in a sense reborn. As a child is born out of the blood and water of the mother, the umbilical sac. It is not that Christ was in need of baptism. And John actually protested this for a moment. He said, Lord, if you read the gospel, he said, Lord, he didn't want to do it. He said, it is I who must be baptized by you. And he said, suffer it now to be so that the law may be fulfilled. Jesus answered him. But he submitted to it because at that time this action was praiseworthy and acceptable before God and presaged the glad tidings of the kingdom, the coming of Messiah. However, he later said that true baptism was not with material water, but with spirit and with water, and elsewhere with spirit and with fire. So this is where the literalists are being inconsistent. You baptize with water, why don't you baptize with fire? Oh, that's just a symbol, they'll say. Well, why do you accept one symbol but not the other? What is meant here by water is not material water, for elsewhere it is explicitly stated that baptism must be with spirit and with fire. And the latter makes it clear that the intention is not material fire and water, since baptism with fire is impossible. So by extension then, this also shows how literal interpretation is sometimes ridiculous. Therefore, by spirit is meant divine grace, by water, knowledge and life, and by fire, the love of God. So here we have Abdu'l-Baha interpreting the symbols himself authoritatively. For material water cleanses not the heart of man, but his body. Have you ever seen a baptism in the Greek Orthodox Church of a baby? I saw that either on YouTube or on Facebook, and I was absolutely shocked. They take the child and they throw the child into the air. And the priest catches the child and he literally launches the baby in the air. It's all part of an elaborate baptism ceremony. I'd never seen anything like it. I was quite astonished by that. The baby becomes a missile, and it's not just immersed, it's thrown up. Okay. So we've read that. In other words, the heart that partakes of the outpouring grace of the Holy Spirit and becomes sanctified is made goodly and pure. The purpose is that the reality of man be purified and sanctified from the defilements of the world of nature, which are vile attributes such as anger, lust, worldliness, pride, dishonesty, hypocrisy, deceit, self-love, and so on. Okay. And then the master goes on to explain and I'll end there in paragraph 8, but in the dispensation of Baha'u'llah, the symbol is no longer required, for its reality, which is to be baptized with the Spirit and the love of God, has been established and realized. So we understand the symbolic nature of it, and Baha'u'llah has so organized his religion that the ritual itself of baptism has been abolished. There's no longer a need for it because we understand the spiritual meaning of it, which, by the way, doesn't weaken the power of that baptism by water and by fire. It's very real. It's not just a symbol, it's a spiritual reality. Well, friends, I've wandered through here not knowing what I'm doing exactly, but I hope I've been able to clarify certain things for you or help you in a certain way to understand what is sometimes very difficult to understand. So Netta said we wanted to go to Q&A now.
Yeah, so before we go to Afsaneh, I do want to say that we do appreciate you being here, and honestly, I think this is exactly what was meant when Shoghi Effendi asked us to read, one of the 3 books, and one of them being the Some Answered Question, is to engage in these types of dialogue, these consultations. It's very, very crucial. It's very, very important, especially for this day and age. So I appreciate everybody who has been asking their questions. And Afsaneh, please unmute yourself.
I have a question about the baptism by fire. Could it mean that by ashes? Because like at Ash Wednesday, they use the ashes to draw a cross on their forehead. So without fire, there are no ashes. So could that be baptism by fire using ashes?
That's an interesting interpretation, Afsaneh. I've never thought of that. The ashes on Ash Wednesday, as far as I know, I'm no expert in Christianity, but is to remind us that we are ashes to ashes, dust to dust. So it's a reminder of the transitory nature of the human condition and of human life, that all must die and that life is short. So you're saying that the ashes, did they still do that in the Christian church? Do they still put
Yes.
on Ash Wednesday? What
Yes.
do they cross the forehead with ashes?
Yes.
Oh, okay. Which church does that, by the way?
I think Catholic Church that I know.
Yes, Catholic Church.
Okay. Thank you, Kathleen.
We have Mehdi, please. Yeah.
I think Ash Wednesday is actually connected with the period between the crucifixion and the resurrection. I don't think it has anything to do with the baptism.
Well, Afsaneh was making a connection there between the fire burns. The fire. I see how the connection she was making. You may be quite right historically, Mehdi, but I see what Afsaneh is doing there. She's making a connection between the fire that burns the wood that creates the ashes.
Yeah, so, I understand that. I understand that. But biblically, ashes is a symbol of mourning.
Yes, yes. in sackcloth and ashes, right? Baptism by fire, says Tina, may mean martyrdom. It could very well.
Okay, do we have any other questions? Okay. All right, well, thank you so much. Jack, did you want to say anything else?
Well, I just wish we were all sitting together in the same place and I could see you physically as well as virtually. It would be much better, but I'm very thankful that at least we got to see one another in virtually. It's certainly better than not at all, isn't it? And to know that we're all believers in this great cause, and even though we're being severely tested by COVID-19, we get these little moments of relief from time to time, and this is one of them. So thank you very much for inviting me, Netta. Maybe I can come back at some time in the future, although I'm very busy right now working on my book on the Haft-Vadi, the Seven Valleys. There's Gail Scott. Hi, Gail.
Yeah, definitely. We would love for you to come back. I do want to, Jamie just put something in chat here, which I think is very interesting, as well as Tina. So Jamie, could you just read what you wrote? And then Tina as well, please, because it's just fascinating. I mean, you know, just, I love it.
Sure, sure.
Jamie.
Well, first I said, but I think it's been mentioned that people can be baptized by water and still understand that it is symbolic. Yes. And I think that was so during the time of John. But then I wrote that, you know, it does seem that water has special meaning in the religious themes, because the Baha'i was known to give miracles with water, especially water from his ablutions. And, you know, that was the water that he gave to the son of the man who was going to take him to the governor. And there was that breakout of colic or something, or not colic, cholera. Yeah. And then the people of Maku, once they recognized his exalted, that he was an exalted being, you know, they would wait to get the water from his ablutions, you know, to aid in healing, you know. And although I don't have any information about, you know, whether or not people were really healed, but I would think they were, because they wouldn't have kept coming back for the water if there wasn't something miraculous happening there. So, you know, water is interesting. I guess I say all that to say,
yeah, it's a wonderful symbol, isn't it? A universal, timeless, wonderful symbol. And yes, I'm glad you pointed that out. We should not assume that every Christian, you know, of course they understand that it's has a spiritual meaning as well.
Stuart, please.
Hi,
yeah, there's a wonderful presentation by Mr. Naqshbandi that's available on YouTube. It talks about consecration by fire. I recommend that you do a search on that. In many ways, I would say that it's similar to the concept of baptism. That's all I want to say. It's not my words. So